First, I'd like to thank Professor Eva Alvarez for arranging for me to be able to give this talk, long distance, to you in Valencia, Spain. The title of my talk today is Away with Your Man Visions, Gender as a Framework for Rethinking Housing and Urban Design. Housing and urban design were very controversial topics in the late 19th and early 20th century. They were part of broad American debates about how public and private life would be defined in an increasingly urban industrial society. Today, I'd like to visit the Grand Domestic Revolution, a book I wrote almost 4 decades ago to document the history of feminist approaches to housing and neighborhood design between the end of the Civil War and the start of the Great Depression. I call these activists material feminists. Their campaigns included critiques of the home as workplace and of women as unpaid workers within their homes. Well, you may be wondering how I came to work on this topic. How did I choose this topic? I'm a feminist architect who became an urban historian. My first book dealt with model towns across the United States from the late 18th century to the early 20th century. My research ranged from looking at the villages of the Shakers to the socialist Llano del Rio community north of Los Angeles. The participants in all these American communitarian settlements argued that building a better town, a socialist town, whether it was religious or secular, would inspire others to copy their model across the country. When I finished that book, which was called 7 American Utopias, I encountered a few clues that women had adopted some of these communitarian ideas and wished to apply them to life in American cities and suburbs. They wanted to shape the economic and social constraints of what was called women's sphere. That is, the confinement of women to the home and to unpaid nurturing within it. I chose the term material feminists to describe these activist women. They wanted to, first of all, transform the patriarchal family. A grand domestic revolution was a phrase from an article promoting child care in 1871. Second, they wanted to establish women's economic independence. They didn't see all women as becoming wage workers eventually. They saw women as skilled workers who needed to take control of their own labor in social reproduction. And third, they wanted to support women's efforts to take part in public life. So what did these activists do? Well, they planned and designed kitchenless houses and women's apartment hotels. They built child care centers, public kitchens, and community dining halls. They wrote novels and manifestos about feminist cities, places where the physical infrastructure would support women's paid work and independent public lives. Of all my books, this was the most fun to research. People kept telling me that my story was absolutely impossible. It couldn't have happened. Who'd have ever heard of a feminist city in the 1860s, the 1890s, 1910s? And yet, I kept finding more and more evidence. The historical context. Let me sketch this for you. After the Civil War, which means in the late 1860s, early 1870s, homemaking was changing. It went from a pre-industrial activity to something that was more involved with all kinds of manufactured goods. Dense urban neighborhoods were being built up within cities. Some of them had commercial laundries, and here's an example of one in Boston in the 1880s. Some of them had hotel restaurants. At the same time, the scale of living was changing. Row houses gave way to apartment hotels and apartment houses. There were new technologies at these new urban scales. At the same time, public infrastructure was being created. City water supplies, sewage systems, refuse disposal, paved streets, electric lights, public transportation, all of these things were happening. No one could really predict how much new infrastructure would be developed. Some of you probably heard of landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted. He favored public parks and built dozens of them in America. But he also thought that municipal kitchens and municipal steam heat for all houses would be a possibility. And maybe some of you have heard of Jane Addams. She was the founder of the settlement house movement in the United States. They ran classes for adult immigrants, built playgrounds, child care centers, and a public kitchen, all within Hull House in Chicago. So, could activist women change urban infrastructure? Many people thought that was a real possibility. And Susan B. Anthony, leading suffragist, was asked about the future of the family after suffrage. She said, "Away with your man visions. Women propose to reject them all and begin to dream dreams for themselves." I'm going to sketch the work of 6 of these activist women for you to give you some profiles and some examples of the kinds of things they built or wanted to build. The first was a woman named Melusina Fay Peirce. In 1868, she created a sensation. She made the news by suggesting that women in Cambridge, Massachusetts, do their cooking, laundry, and mending in a building on Bow Street near Harvard Square, and that then they would present the results, the cooked food, the clean laundry, to their husbands back at home for cash on delivery. This was called the Cambridge Cooperative Housekeeping Society. It was a producers' co-op, and she promoted it through articles in the Atlantic Monthly. She was the wife of Charles Sanders Peirce, who was a Harvard faculty member, and many of the people participating in her group were faculty wives. "It is just as necessary," she said, "and just as honorable for a wife to earn money as it is for her husband." She introduced a plan for suburban kitchenless houses with neighborhood workspace, and I'll show you that next. On the bottom is the neighborhood plan. There would be 4 houses to a block, houses without kitchens, and for every 9 blocks, the 10th block would be a cooperative housekeeping workshop. In her final manifesto, she said 2 things women must do somehow as the conditions not only of their future happiness, progress, and elevation of their sex, but of its bare respectability and morality. First, she said, they must earn their own living, and second, they must be organized among themselves. You're wondering what the husbands thought. One said, "What? My wife cooperate to make other men comfortable? No, indeed." The debates generated very wide publicity, and there were also some cartoons. Here, for example, Currier and Ives showed the age of iron, man as he expects to be, from 1868. Now, Melusina Peirce did not propose men and women changing roles. The cartoonists thought this is what it would come to. The men are mending, doing the laundry, and rocking the cradle, and the women are taking a coach ride to some public event. Interestingly, we see the class system here too. The former coachman has got his hands in the laundry tub, and the former maids and laundresses are driving the coach. Well, it's a complicated set of things that's being proposed by Melusina Peirce, but not exactly what the cartoonists are afraid of. And here's another one. How it would be if some ladies had their own way. The artist in Harper's Magazine in 1868 showed the men all clustered inside, doing some mending and holding the babies, while the women are outside the building, and shocking to see they are smoking cigarettes. Well, Peirce did not want role reversals. She was an iconoclast. She really wanted women in charge of women's sphere. And interestingly, in this political moment, she was against women simply getting the vote or traditional suffrage, because she called that male suffrage. She wanted what she called womanhood suffrage. She said she wanted women to elect women to an all-female U.S. Senate equal to an all-male House of Representatives. If you've been watching the elections in the U.S. as they are happening this November, you'll know that that's a pretty entertaining thing to imagine, an all-female U.S. Senate. There are more women running for public office in the United States than has ever been the case, but they're still not going to be in the majority in either house, even if all were elected. Now, let me tell you about the second of these activists, Marie Stevens Howland. What Marie Stevens Howland added to Peirce's proposals was the suggestion that there should be child care centers, either in the workplace or the neighborhood. She was born in New Hampshire. She was a Lowell mill worker, then a teacher, school principal, editor, and writer. She was interested in the community of Gaudin in France, a follower of Charles Fourier, who created what he called a familistère. It was an iron foundry with a full set of child care facilities. She visited that child care in France in the 1850s, and she also knew about the child care which was at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893 in a project called the Women's Building. Howland also collaborated on the design of an ideal city. With a couple of architects, she proposed a new city which would have consumer cooperatives running everything, kitchenless houses, and child care everywhere. The third of these women is Mary Livermore. Mary Livermore was the leader of successful efforts by the U.S. Sanitary Commission to provision the Union Army during the Civil War. She was a national suffrage and temperance leader. At one point, her nickname was Queen of the Platform because she gave 150 lectures a year between 1872 and 1875. She was the editor of a publication called the Women's Journal and reported on cooperative housekeeping experiments everywhere. These women she described as women of pluck, consecrated common sense, women who knew how to compel success. She was the first of these women to advocate male involvement in housework, suggesting that husbands and sons should do their share. She knew of the summer encampments, Methodist camp meetings, places like Oak Bluffs, Massachusetts, where there were kitchenless cottages and one communal kitchen. She also encouraged people in the suffrage movement to take over the correspondence of the suffrage movement in their dining rooms at home. That is, to use their dining rooms for offices and move their dining tables to form neighborhood dining clubs in houses in the centers of town. Here's one in Warren, Ohio, that ran from 1903 to 1923. She had ties to the nationalist movement and to Edward Bellamy, who was the author of a novel called Looking Backward. Looking Backward is a story about socialist Boston in the year 2000. The hero wakes up there, and everyone dines in large public dining halls, something like Yale or Princeton University's residential colleges. I don't know if you have the same thing in Spain, but maybe you do. Looking Backward suggested that a future which was egalitarian would have to have a communal or collective approach to all the work of feeding families and providing for their daily needs. Bellamy was the most famous of these novelists, but there were dozens of novels and many short stories written about a socialist feminist future, written by women and men and set in American cities, usually in the 20th or 21st century. The next of these activists was a scientist. Ellen Swallow Richards was the daughter of a farm family in Dunstable, Massachusetts, and indeed, in her youth, she had occasionally hired out as a servant. But she became a teacher, and then she got to be the first woman to receive a Bachelor of Science degree at MIT in 1873. She was the first woman appointed to the MIT faculty in 1875. And she developed a new word called ecology for the science of consumption, the science of controllable environment. She worked on food, water, and air. She designed and built a public kitchen that looked like an MIT laboratory. She wanted there to be low-cost and nutritious food for every working family in every working-class neighborhood. Here's the New England kitchen she built in Boston in 1890. It was copied in New York. It was copied at the Chicago World's Fair. Here you can see in 1893 in Chicago the Rumford kitchen she built with a big porch for people to sit and chat. It was a neighborly place as well as a science lab. Interestingly, she expected that well-paid women scientists would be running the business of ecology. You may think this looks like a McDonald's or a fast food place as we know it now, but there are no well-paid women scientists hired by those operations. The fifth of these women is Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Charlotte Perkins Gilman may be a name you know. She was a single parent and a novelist, but her most famous book was called Women and Economics, published in 1898. She promoted what she called a feminist apartment hotel in Greenwich Village, a place where employed professional women with children could live comfortably. She was influenced by the Garden Cities movement in England, where there were cooperative quadrangles being built for professional women with jobs. And she herself influenced some American female architects who designed projects like the ones I'm going to show you next. Row houses with a central kitchen, serviced, and a general kitchen serviced by an underground tram. This was also at the Chicago World's Fair. And here is another designer influenced by Gilman. This is Alice Constance Austin showing people in Llano del Rio, California, kitchenless houses served by a below-ground railroad from a central kitchen. She popularized something called a dinner delivery service as well. Well, we're now in a time when lots of people do takeout, but in 1903, a horse and a cart might bring the dinner to you in a device called a heat retainer. Problems here. Once you popularized a commercial service, it was not clearer any longer whether there would be cooperating women, whether they were housewives in a producer's cooperative or working women in a consumer's cooperative. The question of where this could become a business arose and is complicated by issues about class and race. Here are the servants, which you might have found in 1 out of 10 families in 1900. What were the servants going to find was their situation if the housewives got organized? Sometimes the servants would go on strike, as in Evanston, Illinois, when there was a plan to reorganize housekeeping there. And certainly in 1881, there was a washerwomen's strike in Atlanta that involved 3,000 African-American women. Tara Hunter's book has a good account of that. So was it really going to be all that easy to simply reorganize all of household life? The last in this series of reformers is Ethel Puffer Howes. Ethel Puffer Howes, like Ellen Richards before her, eventually became a professor. She took her BA in a women's college. She was brilliant at mathematics, and she did her PhD at Harvard in 1898. Harvard didn't actually give her the degree. She was a student there, but they did the degree from Radcliffe, which was the female side of Harvard. Harvard then hired her for 8 years as a professor, but her name wasn't in the catalog just because she was a woman. She was married with 2 children. She became a professor at a women's college called Wellesley, and then ultimately a professor at Smith College. She too wrote articles in the Atlantic Monthly. She said suffrage had been won in the 1920s, but it was just a means to an end. The woman question has never had an answer. Ethel Puffer Howes at Smith College in Massachusetts created a curriculum of work-life issues for students at Smith, and she developed what she called the Institute for the Coordination of Women's Interests. They had a nursery school, a community kitchen, as well as that curriculum, a staff of people who dedicated themselves for those 5 years to trying to look ahead to what women with degrees and families would need to sort out their lives in the 20s and 30s. I'm sorry to say that by the beginning of the 1930s, Smith College decided that these were unintellectual and unacademic concerns, and that was the end of her experiment there. So you're wondering, if I were to wrap this up, how would I evaluate the importance of these material feminist activists? They celebrated nurturing as important skilled work. That was their strength. And they didn't want to be economically dependent on men. That was another strength. They were like the progressive era settlement workers who pioneered cleaning up cities under the label municipal housekeeping. And yet, they were not so clear about how class and race and gender would intersect and how this might affect their hopes and plans. And that was their weakness. They were red-baited in the 1920s. After suffrage was won, conservative men attacked women across the board, women in the temperance movement, suffrage movement, women in home economics groups, along with the League of Women Voters and the Women's Joint Congressional Committee. That last group were Democratic and Republican activists who thought that they could work across party lines. Instead, the conservatives claimed that they were all taking their orders from Bolshevik feminist Alexandra Kollontai in the Soviet Union. It was a scare tactic, but to some extent, it worked. And so one would have to ask, why did women in the 20th century, later 20th century, in the second wave of feminism, why did they abandon the material feminist strain of advocacy from the first wave of feminism? Was it really that these manifestos and experiments were all forgotten? Think of Betty Friedan. Her book, The Feminine Mystique, in 1963, wrote about the problems that have no name, problems that the housewives experienced, and curiously enough, Betty Friedan had attended Smith College, the same place where Ethel Puffer House had worked. Maybe these issues were just thought to be too dangerous and complicated. Their writings on space, public infrastructure, and labor suggest it was very difficult to see housing and urban design as issues that needed to be addressed in feminist campaigns. Could the invisible labor of nurturing ever be recognized and remunerated? Think about how our current neighborhoods embody ideas about women's place in terms of the design of housing and the design of infrastructure. Housing is important in any economy. It involves land and paid labor for its production, and for the inhabitants, it frames unpaid labor in social reproduction. Built space is an economic and social product. People shape space at the scale of rooms, buildings, neighborhoods, and cities. But then those physical structures help to support or constrain activities. Architecture does not make social change, but it can support or impede change, especially in defining patterns of private and public life that link shelter to society. As we move past the time of the Grand Domestic Revolution, we can see there were different strategies for dealing with women's labor in different societies. In my later book, Redesigning the American Dream, I described three of those. First of all was what I would call the urban industrial strategy, that women would only achieve full status as citizens if they were paid workers. This strategy might be seen in the USSR with some of the collective houses built there in the late 20s. Here we see a conveyor belt for food, sending the food down the table in a very modernistic and rather unappealing dwelling. More likely, you know the example of the Frankfurt kitchen, which was designed in Austrian and German housing projects in the late 20s. Women workers would be in these kitchens. After a full day in the factory, they would come home to the modernized kitchen to cook all the food for family. I think that's not a satisfactory resolution of the issues, although in some cases communist and socialist architects supported that. We see the exact opposite in the United States, especially after World War II. That's what I call the Hayden strategy. White male workers are going to qualify for mortgages and become homeowners, but women are going to be doing all the cooking and cleaning in those private suburban homes without any child care centers, without any public transportation. This is Levittown, New York. It's on an urban scale, 80,000 people, almost all of them white, no infrastructure. And Levitt, the developer, critiqued all kinds of multifamily housing as un-American. He claimed it was a communist plot, and no man who has a house and lot can become a communist. He has too much to do. The man was going to be taking care of the yard and building some bedrooms and bathrooms in the attic. This was a strategy that described Mrs. Consumer married to Mr. Homeowner. But you know what happened. Eventually, women entered paid work to help pay for the houses and the appliances, and yet they were still responsible for almost all of the nurturing. Increasingly, there were commercial fast food and child care services replacing some unpaid nurturing work. But in many cases, they exploited low-paid female workers who tended to be women of color and new immigrants. Yes, there is a third alternative. Here's the critique of that Hayden strategy, one posed with 7 days work in Life magazine. And here's the third option, the neighborhood strategy. Yes, some places did still think about these nurturing issues, especially in Europe, and emphasized neighborhood supports for women as valued workers. On the screen is a collective house in Stockholm, Sweden, built in 1930 by Sven Markelius and Alfa Myrdal. And here's another example. This is in the United States during World War II, when the Kaiser shipyards needed women workers in Vanport City, Oregon. They ran a child care center 24 hours a day on 3 shifts, and they also provided cooked food for women shipyard workers. But at the end of the war, all of that was gone. And so, at the core of these issues is caring work, nurturing work, the work that economist Nancy Folbray has called the invisible heart. In her 2001 book on economics and family values, she labels them reciprocity, love, and obligation. She says the invisible hand of markets depends on the invisible heart of care. This work is what sociologist Arlie Hochschild has called a second shift, the hours per week of home, nurturing of children that someone, whether female or male, has to take on after hours in the factory or the office. Another book that's very much addressing this is The Price of Motherhood by Aime Crittenden and Fair Shared Cities, which is a collection of essays from Europe, the subtitle, Why the Most Important Job in the World is Still the Least Valued. That's the Price of Motherhood subtitle. And this one is the impact of gender planning in Europe. So in conclusion, I would say that the American material feminist campaigns have been forgotten, largely forgotten, but they still hold interest for researchers on gender justice in many other countries. Many Americans are concerned about how to deal with health and food the way that Ellen Richards was. Many are concerned about the locations of their homes and the costs of their homes and the ways in which family life can be enhanced and improved. The shifting boundaries of private and public are expressed in bodies, rooms, buildings, housing, and neighborhoods over time. They offer many possibilities for interdisciplinary research, and perhaps some of you are doing that research right now. Perhaps some of you are thinking about how to design alternative arrangements for housing and community facilities in Spain or in other parts of Europe. I would conclude with some words of wisdom from the European Charter for Women in the City, a document from 1994. The authors of that charter said, Daily life, as seen through a woman's eyes, must become a political issue. And they added, rediscover the city through women's eyes, abolish stereotypes. Thank you for hearing me out, and I look forward to having your questions in live time very shortly.